Oh, awesome. Okay, so I know you guys have seen this slide already. This is basically what the legal requirements are. And what I wanted to talk with you guys tonight were how to quantify the number of acres that you are irrigating, and also how to estimate that annual quantity and that instantaneous quantity. So again, these are the legal requirements. We won't go over them, but this is specifically what ecology is asking for on those forms. And I think what we'll talk about first is sort of different ways to calculate acreage. And I want to assure everybody that this doesn't have to be a very hard question. A lot of people know exactly how many acres they're irrigating, and for a lot of other people, it's worth taking a look at some of the readily available and free tools that are out there. And I also want to assure everybody that these are tools that, that you can use yourself. And so, I mean, Google Earth is hands down one of the easiest go-to tools out there. It's very easy, and I'm going to show you a couple pictures, but there are other more fancy versions. One of them is, Earth Pro, which is a pay-for service, but allows you to measure things on maps. But then also Whatcom County on their own county website has got some really nice mapping tools, and any of those will work. And so, this is just a snip that I did from Google Earth, and in this case, we're just pulling it up and using the measuring tool. There's a little ruler on it, and we're setting it for a polygon, and we're just putting it onto acres. And on this case, we're just, we're eyeballing it. We're trying to figure out what's being irrigated, what's not being irrigated. You can make this more sophisticated and, cut the roads out, but especially for this first filing, this gives you a really good idea, because, your parcel may be 100 acres, but the area you're irrigating, might actually be smaller. So knowing what that number is going in is going to be really handy. This is just from the county website. Again, it's a big parcel, but we just went in and measured it out, and this will give you kind of that first snapshot of, how many acres you think that you're irrigating. The steps to irrigating, this one is actually from the map tool that Katie showed you. So this is an example of what's showing up on Ecology's site. And I blew it up in my next slide. But in this case, what you're looking at is this yellow boundary is, where Ecology is showing that where the place of use is for that particular water right. And I just thought this one was kind of interesting because, the red is where the place of use is. And you can see, like on the north side, they probably haven't been irrigating. The irrigation is happening, in the yellow part. And then, what's going on the south? You've got kind of a short sheet effect where, these don't always line up. But this gives you a pretty good sense of, what's being irrigated and what is Ecology showing that you're being irrigated, and how big is it? How many acres are you dealing with? Estimating annual quantity. If you've got a water right, it's going to tell you how many, acre feet that you have on it, but you're going to want to vet that yourself and try to understand how much water you're using. This is a old aerial photo, and the blue is kind of a place of use, and so you can see you're looking, you're zooming in on sort of this really high level. It's hard to tell what the heck is going on this particular property, but in this case, this particular map is a Landsat map, so it's showing, red is showing what's being irrigated, the gray is less irrigated. Again, we're zooming in, from the 30,000 foot down to the, 15,000 foot, but it's still really hard to tell what's going on in this particular image. And also this image too is from August. And so again, if you look at that blue line, it's hard to tell. You can see that one half is maybe a little redder than the other half, but still it's not super useful. And then you take it, a month earlier, July, same piece of property, it's really, really obvious, how many acres have probably been being irrigated. And Ecology has all this same information, so, kind of knowing what it looks like, it's going to help you figure out what you want to claim and what you're going to ultimately be able to support. So the annual quantity is derived really from the number of acres that you're being irrigated. So quantifying it, how do you know how much water you're using? So the gold standard is meters. Ecology loves meters. That in theory should tell you exactly how much water you're using, but the problem is not everybody has a meter. You're not required to meter. It doesn't always, serve the need of your farm. And also they can be wrong. They can be low, and they can also, capture years when maybe you weren't using as much water as you were other years. So you always want to kind of, when you're identifying how much water you think you're using, kind of look at multiple lines of evidence to try to, figure out what those numbers are. And so, again, aerial photos is a great place to start in terms of when you look at that photo, what looks irrigated and what really doesn't look irrigated. Landsat imagery, which is those red things. Those are different than your standard aerial photos, but those are images that you can get. But other ways to estimate water use, you have your capacity and runtime. If you know how many gallons a minute your well is putting out, you can estimate how many hours a day you're running that system. You know what your system puts out. That is a perfectly acceptable way to gather information and to record it in a narrative, where you ran that well every day for 8 hours, how many sets you do, how long it runs is super useful. Power records, if your well or your surface water pump has dedicated power, there are ways to back calculate how much water you're using from that power information. And there's a formula, it's actually in the WAC. It's tricky to use sometimes because it really requires you to have a lot of information about the efficiency of your system, but it's definitely worth running the calculation and seeing what kind of numbers you get and how that compares to what you think you're probably using. And crop, we're going to talk a little bit about water use estimates from crop records. Farm records are great. If I'm actually working on this project right now where we know how many tons of silage were being produced from a particular site, and we're able to back calculate. We know what they were growing. We can figure out how much water that probably would have needed. That's another perfectly acceptable way to try to calculate how much water you were using. And affidavits. And they don't have to be formal affidavits. They can be narratives from people who are familiar with the farm, who operated it, who can write down what they remember in terms of, how long did the pump operate, how much water did they use. Those are all really acceptable ways to gather that information. So you don't have to have a meter. It's great if you do, but it's also, even if you do, it's worth trying to calculate it some other ways, because when you start putting those numbers down, they may or may not be binding. So you don't want to underguess. If anything, you want to overguess on some of those. So water budgets and trying to figure out where you can get information. There is a ton of information out there about water duty for different crops. WSU has just a wealth of really simple, easy to use tables. Washington Irrigation Guide has been around since 1985 and is still kind of the go-to for calculating how much water you're using for different kinds of crops. There's more sophisticated data. A lot of it is better on the east side where most of the weather stations are, but there are real-time data sources that can tell you how much water you should be using. And then there's some updates right now that are going on to the Washington Irrigation Guide that I suspect by the time you need it, we're going to have some new, boy, wow, it's really raining. Wow. I know, we got a lot of water problems here. So I just wanted to talk about some of these water calculations. You want to look at, when you start looking at how much water you're using, you want to think about not just the water that your crop needs, Hopefully it's rice if you're watering today. You also want to think about how much water you might need and the basic efficiency of your system. And so Ecology has got a guidance document. It's their guidance document 1210, which is their staff guidance on sort of determining consumptive use of water, which is the water that the crops are taking up, and also the irrigation efficiency. So there's some really good tables and things that are in that document, but to really use it, you're going to want to determine, how many acres you're irrigating, what you're irrigating, and then you're going to want to look at the efficiency of that. And I clipped a section. We can't read this; it's too hard. But this is the 1985 irrigation guide. And so I zoomed in. I hope it's sort of legible. So this is for Bellingham, and this is just a clip. And so this is saying, if you're watering corn, they have field corn, sweet corn, radishes, pumpkins, just about everything you can think of. This is saying that over the course of an irrigation season that you need to apply, 8.11 inches of water. If you're growing corn, that's what, the irrigation guide is saying. And so from that, you want to back calculate using this guidance document. This is kind of how are you irrigating it, right? This shows different types of irrigation systems. So are you flood irrigating it? Do you have one of, like a traveling big gun, that's spraying it out? Do you have a center pivot? This is going to tell you sort of what the expected range of efficiency is for that particular crop type, and then how much of that you can assume is evaporation. And so that number, that 8.11 is going to be, in this case, we assumed 10 acres of irrigation. 8.11 acres is what the Washington Irrigation Guide is saying that you need. And then we're converting it into acre feet. An acre foot is just a foot of water over an acre. But that is telling you to successfully irrigate 10 acres, you probably need about 9 acre feet. This is a really good tool to have in your pocket, but one of the things you mentioned, Bill mentioned, and I just want to let you guys know, there's going to be a lot of early decisions that are made by the court during the adjudication, and one of them very well could be some irrigation established quantities. The Yakima adjudication, I forget what number they used, I don't know, is it like 3 or 4? Yeah, it was like 4 acres. So in the Yakima adjudication, that's east side, right? But they just assumed if you're irrigating, it's 4 acre feet. There may very well be something like that that's established, So, you may need, 9 acre feet to irrigate. 10 acres is a pretty darn low water duty, right? Other crops use a lot more water. So it's just something to be aware of. But when you fill out those forms, you're in the ballpark, right? You're probably not using 100 acre feet to irrigate 10 acres. Is it 20 acre feet? Is it 9 acre feet? This gives you, kind of some bookends to sort of start thinking about what that number might look like. Instantaneous. That is the how many gallons a minute is your system putting out. And if you don't know it, one way that you can figure it out is if you know what kind of pump you have in it. You got a 5 horsepower Franklin submersible pump. You know where your water level is. It's going to have some, in the manual, there'll just be some curves, just like, geometry in 8th grade. It'll give you some ideas about a pump like that, about how much water it can put out. That's a really good guide. The other way is if you know what your irrigation system is putting out, right? If you had a professionally designed irrigation system, you know that it's designed to handle 100 gallons a minute. That's probably what your well is putting out. Pumping test is obvious. I mean, you could take a look at when the well was drilled. Was there a pump test that was done? It may be on the well log, tell you what the well put out. Also you can look at, once you figure out that annual quantity, so back to field corn, when you were irrigating it, about how much water you can divide, and just kind of get a handle on how many gallons a minute would that have to put out to produce that annual quantity in that time frame. So these are all ways, none of them are wrong. You might want to pick two of your favorite and just see how close you get to estimating those numbers. So I just to wrap up, going forward with this, I think all the advice you've gotten is really good in terms of starting to put together your background information. Know what you have, know if you're dealing with, do you have a water right? Do you have a claim? Are you exempt? Getting a handle on how much water do you think you're using? Be able to, verify if, what your authorization is for that. Relinquishment is a big deal. We didn't talk about it in a lot of details, but, this is, you probably all heard of use it or lose it. There are some exceptions to that, and kind of knowing what those are. If you have a certain authorization and you didn't need to use it for certain reasons, sometimes that stops that clock from ticking, and kind of knowing what those are is, especially if you do have a period where there was nobody using water for, over 5 years. And then there's other ways to protect your water rights. So, just a couple thoughts. If you have been irrigating and you don't want to irrigate, there's ways to protect that water by putting it into a temporary trust, which protects the water right while you're not using it. It may be worth using it might be worth doing that if it's been a couple years since you've used the water and you want to stop that clock, especially while you're gathering this information. And then I think the final thing is just knowing what your water rights are worth. This is a closed basin. It's going to be very difficult to get new water rights. So they're very valuable assets, and I realize this is a lot of work, to do, but I think being able to protect your assets is going to, they're important for, your property, and they're valuable. So that's not my dog. This is my coworker Tyson's dog, who wasn't here tonight, so I did his presentation for him. So I think that's everything I have.